There is a particular kind of architectural influence that I want to discuss today. People have discussed the influence of Frank Lloyd Wright mostly as a question of style. What if the question went beyond that, though? What if you could consider Wright's architecture an influence as what you think architecture is allowed to do, and Wright's influence as to what architecture can accomplish? For George Ranalli, that moment of lightning inspiration happened as a kid riding through Central Park, when the Guggenheim suddenly appeared through the trees, still under construction, wrapped in scaffolding, and glowing with presents. He's described that site as the beginning of a lifelong enchantment with architecture. So today I want to talk about Wright's influence on George Ranalli, not as a biographical story, and not simply as a Wrightian style checklist. I want to talk about this as an architectural inheritance, because Ranalli is one of those figures who treats Wright not as a historic idol, but as an actual working toolkit, how to make space feel inevitable, how to make mass and ornament belong together, and how to see architecture as civic art, not just private taste. Let's start first with what Ranalli actually says, because he's quite direct. In an interview, when he's asked about being influenced by Carlos Scarpa, he answers, "Actually, it was Frank Lloyd Wright who made me first want to become an architect." Then, he describes the Guggenheim under scaffolding at dusk, an incredible presence. That word, presence, is our first key. Wright's buildings aren't only functional arrangements, they're experiences, and experiences with atmosphere. Think about the Guggenheim itself. The building doesn't wait in the background. It's a polemic. It announces a new kind of interior. It scripts your movement. It scripts your attention. Ranalli's origin story is caught by this, by "I saw a building that felt alive." The second key is how Ranalli frames his own practice. He calls himself a modernist architect who loves to fold architectural history into the process of making architecture. And he talks about balancing innovation and stability. He asserts that the best work is craft-intensive and meticulous, a synthesis of old and new. But consider that all of this is a very Wright-like posture. Wright never treated modern architecture as a blank reset. He treated it as continuity. New forms, sure, but rooted in the deeper stuff: ritual, shelter, procession, material, ornament, civic life. In other words, modernism has a memory. Ranalli's modernism comes out of that lineage, not modernism as a neutrality, but modernism as a designed culture of architecture, of surfaces, of joining materials, of light and spatial sequence. The cleanest example where Wright's influence becomes visible in Ranalli's built work is the Saratoga Avenue Community Center in Brooklyn, because critics and publications literally describe it in Wrightian terms. There's an architectural record news item with the headline, "Ranalli inspired by Wright for the center." It explicitly says Ranalli's design recalls Wright in its broad horizontal masonry volumes, massing, geometric detailing, and flow of spaces, end quote. The same piece notes that Ranalli did his master's thesis at Harvard on Wright, which is exactly the kind of scholarly intimacy that turns influence into something powerful and purposeful. So now the important thing is what recalls Wright means here. It does not mean prairie-style imitation. In Ranalli's case, this means Wright's deeper habits: horizontality as calm authority, masonry as weight and permanence, geometry as a discipline, and a careful consideration of spatial flow. Ranalli himself, again in an interview, explains how he uses light and mass at Saratoga. Then he contrasts the interior, filled with natural light, through carefully placed irregular openings in the masonry, designed to capture positive daylight effects and shifting atmosphere from day to night. That is an extremely Wrightian sentence structure, architecturally speaking: mass, recess, ornament integral to the wall, the building's edge carefully articulated, light treated as a spatial substance. And Harvard Magazine's profile of Saratoga reinforces the civic dimension, a community building meant to fit the neighborhood but still exist as something in its own right. It describes the main assembly room and the windows, rectangular but irregular, arranged like blocks, making the interior feel emotionally resonant. That, architecture as emotional infrastructure, is Wright's legacy at its most practical. Wright's influence on Ranalli doesn't only show up in public civic work, it also appears in Ranalli's obsession with the interior as a total world. What Wright did in houses where furniture, light, built-ins, and plan sequence become one system. Ranalli's own Ranalli Studio project from 1976 is described by his office as transforming a 400-square-foot studio into an iconic design using a strategy of inserting habitable form inside an existing space and expanding one room into a city dweller's cosmos. That description emphasizes built-in furniture elements, platform dining, banquette benches with storage, a sleeping loft canopying the dining area, bookshelves, and a deliberate choreography of views from the entry towards the windows and the cityscape. I'm not saying that, really, any of this is Frank Lloyd Wright in miniature. I'm saying that the underlying ambition is Wright-like. The interior is constructed as an environment. Space is made legible, memorable, through integrated elements, controlled sightlines, and light effects. This is how influence actually works in architecture. It's often an attitude toward total design, not a borrowed visual motif. Now we get to the most unusual and arguably the most direct way that Wright influences Ranalli. So Ranalli isn't just influenced by Wright as an architect. He's influenced by Wright as a thinker whose ideas are still unfinished form, work that needs interpretation, work that needs reconstruction, and argument in physical form. So if you want the conclusion in one line, Frank Lloyd Wright influences George Ranalli less as style and more as a discipline of making. Wright gives Ranalli permission to believe that architecture must carry presence, that a building can be felt before it is understood. Wright offers a model of modernism that isn't thin or generic, but crafted, where history and innovation can coexist through detail, through mass, through light.